Here in Chapter 6, we're going to be taking a look at some observational methods, and the observational methods are kind of synonymous with qualitative research. So observational methods are ways that we can take a more social approach to observing phenomena in the world. That is, we're not going to worry so much about statistical analysis and setting up experimental conditions and everything. We're going to look at this in a more naturalistic way. And when you think of naturalistic, you can kind of think that we are beginning to support external validity, the ability for us to generalize our results because the results that we're getting are based on natural observances and we're not having any contrived experimental conditions. So let's jump into the objectives, what we're going to talk about, and then we'll get into the content of the lecture. Some of the objectives are that we're going to compare quantitative and qualitative methods of describing behavior. We're going to look at naturalistic observation and talk about some of the methodological issues like participation and concealment. There are going to be cases where we are going to participate in our own studies if we're doing naturalistic observations. We're going to describe systematic observation and discuss some of the issues that go into the use of equipment, some reactivity, reliability, and sampling concerns. We're going to talk about the features of a case study, and then we're going to talk about archival research, which is a type of research where we use existing records, and we'll take a look at the National Center for Educational Statistics in particular, but there are also other statistical records, survey archives, and written records that you could look at. Think of looking through a newspaper, for example. If you go back 100 years, you could see a distinct difference in the types of things that reported as compared to now. So let's take a look at some of the differences between the quantitative and the qualitative approach, and we're going to do that by looking at the characteristics of each. So the quantitative approach, where we are looking at numbers and setting up experimental conditions or using statistics as a way to identify some kind of statistical significance, we're looking at focusing on specific behavior that can be easily quantified. Usually we're talking about magnitude or quantity or duration. So we want to know how much of something is going on, so how much happiness is going on in a particular classroom. We want to know the number of something, so the frequency of something occurring. How many instances of a racial slur do you hear walking across campus? Or something like duration. How long has it been since the last crime that has happened in the city of Olivet? So there are lots of ways that we can quantify behavior. We typically like to use large samples because we're using statistical analysis. We know that statistical analysis requires larger numbers so that we can approach some kind of effect size where we will find an effect if there is one. So we want larger numbers of people. Typically, we assign numerical values to responses. So even if we're asking a question like, how satisfied are you with the services that you've been offered at the bookstore, for example, you would assign the numerical value 1 to 10, even if we had something like very dissatisfied, satisfied, neither dissatisfied nor neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, satisfied or very satisfied. If we had those 5 options, we would still code them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generally. And we also will base our conclusions upon statistical analysis of data. So we're going to use statistics in order to tell us what our results are. In contrast to that, we have qualitative research. And when I say in contrast, I mean we're going to focus on some of the ways that they are different, knowing that we can use qualitative research and quantitative research hand in hand to answer our research questions. But if we're looking at the differences, qualitative research tends to focus on more naturalistic settings, even if it's a conversational-based interview. People are more likely to think that having a conversation is more naturalistic. Sometimes a contrived experience like a playroom would be a more naturalistic experience. So if we wanted to look at how a 5-year-old child plays with another 5-year-old child, we could ask them to do that in a contrived experience, meaning that we could create just a regular playroom with all kinds of toys and activities and things like that. And they could go play as they wish to, so that is still naturalistic observation. So when we think of natural setting, we don't have to go and spy on children in a daycare to see how they play with each other. We could bring them in and have them play naturally. We tend to look at small groups or limited settings with qualitative research because we like to use smaller groups so that we can have more time to look at the qualitative data, so the conversations, the coding that we're going to be doing. If we had a large group of people, we would spend so much time trying to decipher what everybody said or did that we wouldn't be able to actually do a study. There's also something called data saturation. So when you're doing qualitative research, usually you only need between 10 and 12 people when you're looking at a particular piece of research in order to get all the particular responses that you're going to get. That's something that's been found through lots and lots of studies. So with data saturation, you don't need the large groups like you would with quantitative, because you're going to get all the responses that you ever will within a certain range, within 10 to 12 cases if you're doing something like a grounded theory or a general qualitative inquiry. We will express data in non-numerical form. There's a little bit of an asterisk there because we will do some coding where we're looking at the number of occurrences, but generally with the qualitative approach, we want to know what people are saying, what kinds of things that they're saying, and we're going to use the words that they're using, or we're going to be looking at archival research, and we're going to be looking at the kinds of things that were going on socially. So we could look through a newspaper, or we could look at some old city records and look at something like the kind of mayors that were in a city over a long period of time, and we could qualify them based on their political tendencies, which we're not going to assign a number to. We would look at the data in terms of the qualities of the individuals as opposed to a number of some kind. And then what we're going to do with the results is we're going to base our conclusions on the interpretations drawn by the investigators. So the investigator has to become kind of an expert in how to look at the data that they've gotten and draw conclusions based on what they have found. So they don't rely on statistical analysis, which is typically easier, but they're going to rely on the idea of their own expertise in the field that they're working in order to draw the conclusions themselves. So what do we mean by naturalistic observations? Well, what we're talking about is watching people or gathering data as people would normally do whatever that thing is that they're doing. Whether it's eating at the KC, working at a job, teaching in a classroom, learning in a classroom, whatever it is, we want to see them in that natural environment as they would be normally engaging in that activity. We sometimes call this field work. So if he's talked about somebody doing some field work, what they're talking about is doing some naturalistic observation. They're going to where the people are who are doing the phenomenon that they're interested in studying. So the researchers study people in the social organizational settings. Lots of times it's animals if they're going to do animals in a natural habitats. Like if you are in neuroscience, if you're in Dr. Knapp's neuroscience class, you will go to Binder Park Zoo and you will observe animals in the natural settings and look at the social strata within a particular species of animal. I remember when I did it, I was observing kangaroo, and it was very interesting. They slept a lot because it was the middle of the day, but you could still tell that there was some social strata there. Anyways, we'll look at the social or organizational setting to see what kind of behaviors or phenomena are occurring in those settings. Kind of a very interesting study was done by Scribner in '97, and this study was about looking at the ways that people learn math, and they were looking at basically interviewing individuals and talking about how they did math for their job, and they found that when people were able to do complex mathematics, it was because they've learned to take shortcuts, or they've learned to organize math in their head. They've conceptualized math in a certain way that allowed them to not necessarily do math in terms of if we ordered 120 of these things at 92 cents per item, how much would it be? But rather they knew how much a case cost, and they multiplied the number of cases that they would have, which is usually a smaller number, by the item cost. And they found that it wasn't a matter of them being math geniuses. It was a matter of them working with the same numbers all the time. So, and they wouldn't have found that if they would have just done a quantitative research methodology, because they would have completely missed the fact that people weren't just doing really cool mental math, they were using conventions along the way. So through the process of interviewing and going into the field and talking with the people who they were interested in exploring, they found this phenomenon to be true, otherwise they would have missed it. So the naturalistic observation has that kind of intimacy about it to where you can find results that you normally wouldn't find just by doing a quantitative analysis and asking people maybe to do complex math problems in their head. An interesting aspect, again, of naturalistic observation is the idea of participant observation. If you've seen the movie Saw, it's a scary movie. I don't want to see it again. It was awful for me. I don't like scary movies. But in the movie Saw, there was a participant observation where the person who was doing the study, quote unquote, was a part of the study itself. So when that happens, when somebody goes into a setting and does the study themselves, you have to be careful about you have to be careful about a bias, because as the researcher going in, and maybe what you want to do is you want to go to a nice fancy dinner and you want to observe what kind of things people talk about. And you're sitting at a table with other people and you're engaging in the conversation. You could accidentally lead the conversation just because you have this bias, and if you're not careful about it, you could accidentally guide the conversation in a way that supports your hypothesis, and the results would be based on your guiding the conversation as opposed to the actual naturalistic observation. When we are in a study, like a qualitative study, and we know that we have biases, what we do with those is we bracket them. That's a term for qualitative analysis called bracketing, meaning that we are going to take what we know about ourselves and we are going to thoughtfully and carefully try to eliminate that from the interpretation of our results. Most of the time we can do a pretty good job because humans are generally pretty good at introspection, but there are cases where we have these unconscious biases and we can drive research in a certain way and not know it. So we have to be careful there. But there is the upside that we can get a lot of data that's not available to non-participant observers. So let's say that we wanted to know what people talked about at a fancy dinner. If we asked them what they talked about after the dinner, they might not remember things, or maybe they've had a few drinks and their recollection's a little bit fuzzy. You can't get the same results. So when you're a participant observer, you can get results that you usually can't get by asking somebody after the fact. So concealment can also be a tricky part of that. So you have to decide whether or not you're going to let people know that you are a part of the study or not, or that you are conducting a study or not. One of the big concerns with that, again, is ethics. We need to make sure that we are using concealment appropriately and that there is a debriefing process that goes into that. We talked about deception in Chapter 3 and when we can deceive and when we can't deceive. So you have to use a thoughtful, ethical lens in order to determine if your deception is appropriate. The basic idea of naturalistic observations is to do a lot of describing and analyzing. So we want to describe what's going on in the setting and the events and with the people, and then analyze and interpret what we observed. So the big deal with naturalistic observations or with any qualitative approach is to get all kinds of data about the phenomenon that you are trying to study. Excuse me. When we are doing a qualitative analysis, we want to get all kinds of data and try not to leave anything out. Once we get all the data, our work starts, because we have to spend a lot of time sorting out the data, grouping it into themes, trying to find out what, if we're using the example of what is being talked about at a fancy dinner, we have to come up with topics or themes that people will talk about, and then we have to qualify or count the number of times that somebody engaged in that kind of talk. And after we've analyzed and interpreted what we observed, we start to develop a story or a narrative about what people talk about at fancy dinners. When we keep our detailed notes, sometimes we can use interviews by what we call key informants. Kind of makes it sound like it's a spy movie or something. Really what it is we find people who are experts in their own experiences and ask them about some of the questions that we have, and then combine that information with what we observe naturally. Sometimes we'll use audio or video recording. Lots of times it's easier, especially with technology, to do an audio recording and then run it through some kind of fancy software that will create transcripts of the observations that we have. And once we have our transcripts, then we can go through and kind of highlight the areas that have common themes. Undoubtedly, the final report is going to that you create as a result of doing a qualitative analysis is going to be using multiple confirmations, either through key informants and your own observations, maybe through multiple individuals. Very rarely do we do a qualitative study where we use one individual's perspective. Normally it's going to be multiple people so that we can get a broad spectrum of experience with a particular phenomenon. There are some limitations to naturalistic observations, just like there are limitations to all different kinds of research methods. Usually when we're investigating complex social settings, the naturalistic observations can be tricky because there's just so much going on. You would get so much data that we wouldn't be able to really qualify it all in a cohesive body of work. Imagine going to the KC and sitting down and saying, I am going to observe what the behaviors are of people at the KC. And maybe you're going to kind of talk about what their conversations are like. So you would sit down and you would listen to a table and you would listen to their conversation. You take some notes. Then you do that with each table. Imagine the variety of conversations you'd be listening in on. You might not be able to get all the information that you need from all of those conversations. And even if you did, you'd have so much information you wouldn't be able to make a cohesive narrative about it because of how complex things are. Imagine you can do the same thing in a school setting. You can do the same thing in like a work setting. You go into a factory and you want to know what the experiences of all the workers are at the factory. Well, at a factory, there are people who have all kinds of different jobs. So you wouldn't be able to just say, okay, I'm going to look and see how everybody likes their job at this factory, because you would not be able to consolidate all the information based on how complex everybody's job is and how different they can be from one another. Sometimes we are limited in qualitative methods or naturalistic observation methods because the hypotheses don't really follow a strict outline. So with quantitative research, our hypotheses are very specific and they abide by a particular statistical analysis and a research question, etc. In naturalistic observation, you can't really have a good hypothesis because you can't really make a guess, or you can't really limit what your observations are likely to be like into one sentence. If you did, it would be so vague it would be meaningless. So for example, if I wanted to create a hypothesis about observing everybody's conversation at the KC, it would be something like, my hypothesis is that there will be a diverse amount of conversations at the KC covering a large amount of topics. Okay, duh, that's going to be true, so it's almost useless to even say that. As a matter of fact, that hypothesis wouldn't even have a null hypothesis to it. You couldn't even say something like, the null hypothesis is that the conversations will not be diverse and won't have a wide variety of topics. Of course they will. That's not even a real hypothesis. So the hypotheses become meaningless and less well-defined when you are using qualitative research. And the last limitation, well, there are many, but the last one we're going to talk about is that field research can be extremely time-consuming, and it does require detailed analysis. So some people think, well, I'm going to do qualitative research because I'm scared of statistics. Well, I'll tell you what, you're going to have a lot more work on your hands doing qualitative research just because of the amount of time that it takes. And once you get your data in qualitative research, that's when your work really starts. And in quantitative research, after you get your data, that's kind of all the work you have to do. The rest is just analysis, which goes pretty quickly. When I was doing my dissertation, I spent about 5 months preparing my instruments to get my data. Once I got my data, I had all of my results done in an afternoon. it doesn't take long. But in qualitative research, it's the exact opposite. You might be able to dive into your research questions and getting your data, but after that, you're going to spend months coding it and analyzing it and making sure that it all works well. A type of naturalistic observation is called systematic observation. And with systematic observation, as opposed to just receiving data and interpreting it, you are looking for specific behaviors. And generally what happens is you will look for a specific behavior and you will have maybe, let's say, 4 or 5 different behaviors that you're interested in finding. So let's say that I am interested in the behaviors of students in a college classroom. And maybe I'm interested in looking at boredom, excitement, interest, anger, and something else, happiness, how happy people are to be there. I would limit myself to observing only those 5 behaviors, and I might systematically choose to take 30 seconds out of every 5-minute interval and look at each person and list which one of those behaviors that they are exhibiting at that moment. Usually this is just a way to quantify the types of behaviors and to get an overall assessment of a particular behavior in a group of people. There are lots of different examples of how we can use systematic observations, but generally the observations are quantifiable. We can count them, or we can measure how long something happens, or we can talk about the magnitude of something. We usually have a hypothesis about the behavior. So as opposed to just a naturalistic observation where we're receiving data and making our inferences based on that, we are going to say to ourselves, well, prior research indicates that people who have a class at 7:50 in the morning are probably more bored than people that have a class at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we would start with some kind of hypothesis and see if our data confirms it. We can use naturalistic and laboratory settings for systematic observations. So as far as a qualitative method goes, this one can kind of span. And the reason why it spans quantitative and qualitative so well is that we are looking at specific behaviors that are planned ahead of time. And we're going to code those behaviors somehow. And when we are looking at systematic observation, we are looking at using a coding system. So we are going to code our behaviors according to those 5 characteristics I mentioned earlier. And we are going to say, okay, if somebody is resting their head on the table, maybe we're going to consider that to be bored. It could be tired too, but just for the sake of what we have, we're going to say bored. And if somebody is smiling and looking, maybe they're happy. And if they are looking intently at the instructor, maybe that is somebody who is interested in the topic. So we have to use our operational definitions of each behavior, and we will label it something. So somebody who is happy will have some behavior, somebody who is bored, somebody who is tired. Okay, we will talk about what all those behaviors are. That way, when the researcher observes the behavior, they're able to know what they observed. And hopefully, if we have more than one researcher, then we will have inter-rater reliability, meaning that each researcher will agree on the behavior that they saw. So I kind of stepped on my foot a little bit. Here's more talking about coding. I kind of got into it on the last slide. But remember, with coding, we want to decide which behaviors we're talking about, choose the setting, so if it's naturalistic or if it's an experimental, or we need to develop a coding system, so the rules that we use to categorize the observations, so the operational definitions that we use in order to qualify the behaviors that we are going to observe. There are some methodological issues in systematic observation. We need to talk about how we're going to record the data. So if we're going to use paper and pencil, or if we're going to use video or audio. The issue with that is that we have to talk about reactivity again. When we are observing people's behaviors using systematic observation or naturalistic observation where people know that you are conducting a study, we need to be concerned with how people respond based on our presence. If we are not concealed, so if we're in the open and people know that we're conducting a study, our presence can affect behavior. You've seen that before. Imagine being in a classroom with a new instructor. Everybody's behaving differently. They're kind of casing things out to see how the new instructor operates, how they are, and maybe how nice they are, how strict they're going to be. And then later on, they become more and more less reactive. Probably less and less reactive. And that's usually because people get comfortable. We habituate. We get comfortable with each other. So generally, with reactivity, we need to, allow people the understanding that the results are confidential. They're going to remain private and things like that. But reactivity is still an issue. Usually, if somebody is sitting there with pen and paper and taking notes on things, the people who are being observed are less likely to be reactive. But if they are audio or video recorded, they're more likely to be reactive because all of their behaviors are on tape for posterity, and they have to kind of be on their best behavior or whatever it is. They're going to react differently because they know that their behavior is being permanently documented. So we do need to be careful about reactivity whenever we're using systematic observations. Another type of naturalistic observation is called the case study. And you've probably heard of a case study. It's usually where you follow around an individual and very acutely document what goes on based on the phenomenon that you're interested in. So let's say that we are interested in following somebody who has terminal cancer, and we want to know what kind of attitude they have about it. So we document their behavior, some of their thought processes that they report to us, and even their self-talk to see how some people cope with a terminal cancer diagnosis. We can do that using a case study. And case studies are incredibly helpful because they allow us to observe behaviors or elements that you can't ask people to engage in. With systematic observation, we could have somebody sit in a room and watch a scary movie, and we could observe how they respond to it. It's not ethical and a generally nice thing to ask somebody to acquire cancer in order for us to study them. Obviously, there's a clear ethical issue there and a practical issue. So we use case studies on individuals who have either a rare issue going on, or with an individual that has something that you cannot ascribe to somebody, like a cancer diagnosis or something. So if we're using an individual in a case study, we're using an idiographic approach, meaning that we are looking at one person's story. Okay, or we can use a homogeneous group, which is called nomothetic. So we can look at a group of people that have a particular similarity that we're interested in. We could look at people who are ambidextrous to see what it's like for them to get around in the world. Obviously, there's probably not too much of a problem with them getting around in the world, but we know that for people who are right-handed, you prefer to grab a door with your right hand, and if you're left-handed, you prefer to grab a door with your left hand. And we want to know if there is a preference or a difference in how people who are ambidextrous go through the world. Well, we could do that using a nomothetic case study by following around a group of ambidextrous people. So case studies don't always have to involve naturalistic observations. There can be a clinical approach to it. There can even be a historical account of an event that we look at from a case study. You can look at cases that have happened in the past. When we look at a particular case study and we want to apply a psychological theory to it, we can call it a psychobiography. So if we want to look at somebody who has had issues rebounding from something traumatic in their life, we could find somebody who has post-traumatic stress disorder, and we could apply some kind of theory of trauma to them to describe why they're having a hard time rebounding from a situation that happened to them that was traumatic. Now, not to say that people should just rebound from it, but we want to see why people rebound differently from others. So we could apply some kind of a trauma-informed care or a trauma-focused theory that would describe why somebody has a problem rebounding from a traumatic event, and somebody who has PTSD. So we would apply the psychological theory to the life of that individual. And you'd be surprised, maybe the psychological theory goes back to childhood, to where they were not taught to be resilient in the face of adversity as a child, which has led them to not be able to be resilient to adversity as an adult. Again, I'm not saying that people just rebound magically from trauma. What I'm suggesting here is that we can apply psychological theory to describe why somebody might not be doing it. So again, the case studies are valuable. They inform us about conditions that are rare, unusual, or noteworthy that we can't replicate clinically, and they may lead to hypotheses that can be tested with other methods, so it can be valuable in that way. Now, the last idea I want to talk about is archival research. In archival research, we're going back in time as a way to look at something that's already happened, so data that's already been collected, but maybe to analyze it in a different way. With archival research, we can use statistical records, survey archives like the General Social Survey, and written and mass communication records. So we could look back at maybe some kind of official government documents that have been changed over time to see what kind of things were going on in the world at the time of the change. We've looked in chapter 3 at ethics and some of the documents that have come out of the need to make changes to ethics, going back to the Nuremberg Code, which came out of the need to develop research ethics based on what had happened during the atrocities of Nazi internment of Jewish peoples. Then we look at the Declaration of Helsinki, and then we look at the Belmont Report, then we have the APA Ethics. We could look at those as archives of what was going on at particular times that required the change. For example, more recently, we could look at an ethics code like the APA, the American Counseling Association, and find that they're adding things about telehealth or teletherapy. That's coming out of the need for people who are going to use remote ways of getting therapy because technology has caught up to the practicality of doing such things. So we could look and see what was going on. So we have something like an iPhone that comes out in 2007 or something like that. So 13 years ago, we have the iPhone, which allows us to do video calling. That's kind of one of those things that propels the need for telehealth. So we have these instances where we can look at the archives. Let's take a look at the National Center for Education Statistics and just look at a quick archive. And this is just a list of the total fall enrollment in degree-granting post-secondary institutions. So how many people are in college in the fall by attendance status, sex of the student, and control of the institutions, whether they're private or public or whatever. So we could go back here and we could look at all these numbers, and yeah, it's numerical, but we could look at all the numbers and see what the enrollment in colleges looks like over time. So let's look back in 1947, the total college enrollment was 2.3 million people. That's back in 1947. The total college enrollment for people in the last year that this was published in 2019 was 21,753,000 people. So we've increased the number of people in colleges tenfold, and it's expected to increase to 23,290,000 in the year 2025. Oh, pardon me. 2014 was the last when we had the actual numbers. The rest are projected. So 2019 wasn't the last. 2014 was, but it still is at 20,207,000, which is still approximately a tenfold increase. And you could look at all the different columns, but what's interesting about this is you could find small spikes in here somewhere if you graphed these over time and you had a nice little line plot. You could graph these to see where the spikes happen and maybe where college enrollment decreased. So maybe it decreased or stayed the same somewhere around the start of a war like the Vietnam War, or maybe it increased because people went to college to avoid the war. So very interesting things that you could look back and see over time. You could also look and see the sex distribution over time. So, we have percent female. Percent of female students in 1947 was 29%. If we come up to the last known year, 2014, it's 57.0%. So the percentage of women in college in 2014 is 57%. That's approximately twice as many by percentage that were going to full-time college in 1947. So there's a big change there, and it seems to have happened over time. But if we graph this, we might see a spike somewhere. So when we look at the statistical analyses using archival research, there's a lot to be gathered from that, from a theoretical standpoint, especially if we're able to find when this happened against certain things that happened historically. And last, when we look at archival research, we do need to talk about content analysis. So content analysis is kind of like what systematic observation is. Content analysis allows us to go back and code certain things that happened over time. So we can go back through, I like to use newspapers as this example for content analysis. We could go back and look at the ways that language was used in 1950 and determine if there is a difference in the use of ethnic or racial slurs or even insensitivities. For example, somewhere along the course of time, people who were of Asian descent, which is what we refer to them now, people who were of Asian descent were called people of Oriental descent, and that changed somewhere. So we could look and see the occurrence of the use Oriental to refer to people of Asian descent. We could look and see in 1950 how many times in a newspaper the term Oriental was used to describe those people, as opposed to the Asian phrase. Or we could look at it at a newspaper in 1950 and a newspaper in 2010 and see what the difference is between the use of the term Oriental to describe Asian people. But we'd have to describe what we're looking for and then look for that thing and code it to see if there is amount of times, or what is the amount of times that particular word was used. We can do that for anything. We could do it for an idea. We could say how many times was a disparaging comment about women used in a newspaper. And we could code it that way. So we'd have to talk about the operational definition of what a disparaging comment is and then quantify the amount of times that happens. Archival research can answer questions that can't be studied through other means because we can go back and look through something that's already happened. Aside from taking a revisionist history approach to things to where, the things that were said then don't matter now. Okay. Aside from taking that approach, what happened historically has happened, whether or not we like it. Okay. So obviously this is not a political thing. I know that there are things going on right now about cancel culture and things like that, and the need for us to be careful about the kind of people or ideas that we hold dear to us just because they happen in history. But when we look through these archival records, we need to understand that what has happened and been reported, as far as it was accurate then, is how it was. Okay, we know we need to be careful again. I know we like to kind of lampoon the news because of all the different aspects and talk about things like journalistic integrity and such. But what has happened, and we can obtain records that way. The problem is that sometimes we can't obtain all the desired records that we want, and we also can't be certain about the accuracy of others' research. So if there was somebody who made a mistake in a newspaper article, for example, we might take that for the truth, and we would make an error in the assumptions that we make about that. So archival research can be helpful, but there are some problems that can come into play. So that was Chapter 6 on observational methods. It's a very interesting chapter for those of you who might be interested in going and doing some qualitative research. It's a good introduction to the various ways that we can use observational methods. My encouragement to you is that if you're interested in a research question that has to do with the qualitative or an observational method, then go after it. Please don't be drawn to this just because you're afraid of statistics. It is a well-documented thing that qualitative research is very difficult and requires a lot of thought. And you might think to yourself, well, I just don't like numbers. Well, guess what? You're going to be working with numbers here too. So be careful about how quickly you want to jump into this just because you're afraid of qualitative methods. But then again, if you are interested, certainly get into it. So that is the Chapter 6 on observational methods. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you can do with this stuff.